need you to write down the following empires in your notebook and take some good notes on them. So pause the recording, write these down, and leave some space to take some notes. Basically, what I'm going to do to talk about these empires is give you a 1,000-year history of Israel in about 10 or 12 minutes. And if I were to try to give you a 1,000-year history of the United States in 10 or 12 minutes, the simplest way to set that up is to make a timeline and to put important dates from U.S. history on that timeline. So I could take all of these dates. This is very Eurocentric, assuming that the United States was discovered by Europeans like Leif Erikson in the year 1000, or by people like Christopher Columbus in 1492. But you'll notice that the line changes color in 1776 when we became a nation, and that the line divides in two from 1861 to 1865 to illustrate the Civil War. So if that concept of a timeline is useful to you, then I can start painting a picture of Israel's history using a timeline as well. First, a little bit of geography. This is a map of Palestine in the time of Jesus, which is where we're heading eventually in this class. And since this is very complicated, I'm going to draw a very simplified one that you should be able to recognize. We've got the Sea of Galilee up here in the north, the Jordan River wiggling down through the valley to the Dead Sea, 2,000 feet below sea level. The Mediterranean Sea is over here. Now, after King Solomon dies, the kingdom of Israel, the 12 tribes, are going to split into two countries. There's going to be the nation of Israel in the north and the nation of Judah in the south. Israel will comprise the top 10 tribes, Judah, the one largest tribe, and the little tribe of Benjamin gets split in half, and Hebrew does not do very well with fractions. The capital city of Israel will be Samaria. I'm kind of oversimplifying things, but that's okay. And the capital of Judah will be Jerusalem. And you should already have some notes for Jerusalem, and you might want to turn to your cities page and make a note that Samaria will become the capital city of the northern tribes after the kingdom splits. So, on to our timeline. You don't need to draw this timeline, but pause it and fill in information on the empires as we go through it. The first kind of date we have for ancient Israel, which we can corroborate with outside sources, is approximately 968 BC. We have a Home Depot receipt for several million board feet of lumber from a guy named Solomon who's building a temple in Jerusalem. And so again, we had Saul as the first king of Israel, who brought the 12 tribes together. We had David as the second king of Israel, who brought peace to Israel by conquering its enemies. And then Solomon brings prosperity to Israel, building a beautiful capital city and a beautiful temple in Jerusalem. And after Solomon dies, the kingdom splits in two in 931. And whether you want to call this a schism or a schism or a tomato or a tomato, we're going to have now two separate timelines. Israel in the north, the northern 10 tribes with the capital at Samaria, and Judah in the south with its capital at Jerusalem. And the northern tribes are going to be seen as splitting away from the family of David, and generally the authors of the Bible see the northern tribes as evil, as not faithful to God. And this is illustrated in a series of great stories that we will read later, the stories of Ahab and Jezebel and the prophets Elijah and Elisha. But eventually Israel lasts for about 200 years, and they get squashed by the first big empire of the ancient Middle East to enter into the biblical story. The history of the Middle East is the history of empires coming in and taking control of areas for a while to profit from the geography and the resources, something that's still happening in the modern world today. And empires would come in, they would conquer people, they would tax the people and profit off of them. And the first one to emerge enters the picture in about 700 or 800 years before Jesus. That's the Empire of Assyria. And the Assyrians come in 721, destroy the capital city of Samaria, and burn the place to the ground, conquer other cities as well. And then what the Assyrians would do to control their people is when they conquered an area, they would take the people and move them to other parts of the Assyrian Empire. So in 721, not only does the northern kingdom get conquered by Assyria, but the people are actually carried away into slavery and essentially disappear from the history books, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And as I said, the Assyrians would move people around in their empire to reduce the chance of rebellion. And the Assyrians bring in a group of foreigners from different places elsewhere in their empire and settle them in the northern tribes. And these people adopt the worship of Yahweh and are never really accepted by the people in the south, the Jews of Judah. And these people take their name from the capital city of Samaria. They become known as the Samaritans, and they're going to be important later on. So the Assyrians conquer the north, send the people into exile, and then bring in a bunch of foreigners who become known as Samaritans. The southern kingdom of Judah is generally seen more favorably by the biblical authors because they're following the family of David. The southern kingdom actually survives the Assyrians. They attack Jerusalem, and a king named Hezekiah survives their attack, guided by his prophet Isaiah. We will read their stories later. And then a new empire emerges on the scene, takes over from the Assyrian Empire, and that empire is Babylonia. And Babylonia comes in a couple of hundred years later and conquers the southern kingdom. I'm oversimplifying what's going on here, but for our purposes, I will give you the date of 587, which is the date that the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple built by Solomon, burned Jerusalem to the ground, and then Babylonia, similar to Assyria, takes the people of Judah, or at least many of the people of Judah, and uproots them and carries them off into exile in the Babylonian Empire. This is the beginning of what we call the diaspora. That will be a vocab word on a later test. But the Babylonians take the Jews, the people of the southern kingdom, and carry them away into exile as well. And at this point, if the people lost their identity, if they lost their identity as Jews, the story of Israel and Judah would end at this point. But what happens next is rather interesting. The Babylonian Empire is conquered in turn by the Persian Empire, and rather than moving people around and trying to manipulate conquered countries like the Assyrians and the Babylonians did, the Persians liked to let people generally live where they wanted to, maintain their local identity so that they would be happy tax-paying citizens. And so the Persians actually let the Jews come back from exile. The Israelites in exile maintain their identity through the work of the different prophets such as Ezekiel. And the Persian Empire is seen as this great savior, that Cyrus of Persia lets the Jews go back to Jerusalem, lets the Jews rebuild their temple, allows the Jews to reestablish their identity and their former ways of worship. So, in general, the Persian Empire was a lot more stable. Of course, if you crossed the Persians, they had horrible things they would do to you, but their empire, rather than lasting just 100 years or so like the Assyrians and Babylonians, is much more like the United States, and is around for at least 200 years or so. But all good things come to an end, and the Persian Empire is eventually conquered by Alexander the Great, or Alexander the Macedonian, about the year 330. None of these dates, by the way, are required. And the Greeks have a completely different way of running their empire. The Greeks believed that if they could make everybody in their empire the same, everybody worshiping the same gods, speaking the same language, reading the same literature, sharing the same philosophy, that they would be one big happy Greek empire. This is actually called Hellenization, something you might have learned about in world history, something that I will talk about later. But the Greek method of converting everybody to Greek culture and religion, though it worked in many places, the Egyptians gave up their sun god and began worshiping the Greek sun god. The Palestinians or the Philistines gave up their fertility goddess Astarte and began worshiping the love goddess of the Greeks. This does not work very well in the Jewish area because the Jews feel it's horrible to turn away from their God. So what happens is the Jews actually revolt against the Greeks and establish an independent Jewish state for the first time in several centuries. The Maccabees rebel against the Greeks, the Hasmonean family rebel against the Greeks, and actually are successful and establish an independent Jewish nation that lingers for a little bit under a century. The Jews were successful revolting against the Greeks in part because they had appealed for help from an up-and-coming empire, that's the Roman Empire. And when the Jewish royal family and the different political parties began feuding among themselves, the Romans were happy about 70 years before Christ to come in and take over Palestine in their turn. So over the years, the Israelites get smashed by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. And throughout all this, and not of great significance, the Egyptian Empire is involved on the periphery. Sometimes they were allies to the Jews, such as in the case of the Assyrians. That's part of the reason why the Assyrians attacked Jerusalem, is because the Jews were making an alliance with Egypt. Sometimes the Egyptians were opponents. For instance, King Josiah allied himself with the Babylonians and fought against the Egyptians. So the Egyptians are kind of on the timeline periodically, but they don't have the same impact, except for obviously the enslavement of the Jews in the time of Moses. They don't have the same impact during this particular 1,000-year period of history. And I would note, too, that though you may have heard of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and though Greece is still a nation and Rome is still an important city, that of all these different groups that you see on the timeline here, it's actually the Jews, this small, odd group of people who worship a God who's very demanding, that has actually persisted through this part of history. So again, if you have some good notes on each of those empires, there will be a section on the next test about it. And I think we're getting a bell soon, so that should lead me to sign off.